In the dim candlelight of a medieval courtroom, the air was heavy with fear, judgment, and whispered accusations. Imagine a village square at dawn, cobblestones slick with dew, where townsfolk gathered not for celebration but for condemnation. A young woman stands bound, trembling, her eyes cast to the ground as the bailiff reads aloud her crime. Not theft, not murder, but dishonor, violating the strict codes of sexual morality that governed medieval life. Her fate would not just be punishment. It would be spectacle. The Middle Ages were an age of rigid hierarchy, where the church's authority stretched into every corner of existence. Personal behavior, especially women's, was never truly private. Adultery, fornication, or even the suspicion of impropriety could drag a person from their home into the cold glare of public judgment. But these trials were about more than enforcing moral conduct. They were tools of control, reinforcing power structures, and sending chilling messages to entire communities. Today, we explore how sexuality became a battlefield of authority. This is not a tale of romance, but of humiliation, punishment, and fear, of how medieval justice often turned the personal into the painfully public. Let's begin where morality and law collided most fiercely, in the shadow of the church. In medieval Europe, sin was not just a personal failing, it was a public threat to the entire community. The church taught that unchecked immorality would bring divine wrath, famine, or plague. Bishops and priests acted as guardians of the soul, and courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, became instruments for rooting out impurity. Church law reached into bedrooms and private lives. Confession boxes were not only for spiritual guidance but also sources of information. A whispered admission of sin could quickly become evidence in a public case. And while men certainly faced moral trials, women bore the heaviest burden. Their bodies, their behavior, even their clothing were policed in the name of virtue. Accusations of adultery or fornication could devastate entire families. A noblewoman might lose her dowry or lands. A peasant girl could lose her reputation, her livelihood, and her future. Sexual morality trials blurred the line between justice and spectacle. They were not only about sin but about power. Power over women, power over desire, and power over those who dared to step outside their prescribed roles. Punishments for moral crimes were often designed to shame rather than simply to wound. Public humiliation was a favorite tool because it corrected behavior in two directions at once. It punished the guilty and terrified the onlookers. In town squares, women accused of sexual misconduct were placed in stocks or pillories, devices that locked the body in place for hours or even days. Passers-by jeered, spat, or threw rotten food. These punishments were deliberately visible, a way to mark someone as impure, dishonorable, or fallen. The scold's bridle, an iron mask with a spiked bit for the tongue, was sometimes used on women accused of gossip or loose behavior. While not always tied directly to sexual crimes, it symbolized society's attempt to silence female voices and control female bodies. Even in cases where no physical torture was involved, the humiliation could be crushing. A single day in the pillory could ruin a woman's reputation for life. Medieval justice didn't just punish behavior. It branded the accused as morally corrupted. Ironically, while moral courts punished real relationships, the aristocratic courts of love celebrated idealized, poetic romance. Noblemen and women debated the rules of courtship and passion as if love were a noble game. Yet outside these salons, real women of flesh and blood, especially common women, faced severe penalties for living out desires that aristocrats merely romanticized. Ecclesiastical courts were relentless. They prosecuted everything from secret marriages to living in sin. Some trials even questioned whether a marriage had been consummated, with judges demanding invasive testimony from the couple or neighbors. Privacy barely existed, and the court's obsession with purity turned intimate life into a public performance. Among the nobility, sexual misconduct was not just sin, it could be political treason. A queen accused of adultery risked far more than personal disgrace. Consider the tragic case of Anne Boleyn centuries later. Though Tudor England was no longer fully medieval, the old ideas of sexual morality as political danger still held sway. For noble women, accusations of unfaithfulness were often a weapon in power struggles, used to remove rivals or justify executions. Even for ordinary women, accusations of adultery could be lethal. In some regions, the penalty for confirmed adultery was death, though more often it was severe flogging, exile, or enforced penance. Husbands sometimes brought wives to court to restore honor, not always because they believed in their guilt, but because failure to act could make them seem weak. In a world obsessed with lineage and inheritance, sexual morality was never just personal. It was tied to wealth, property, and bloodlines. One of the most haunting punishments for moral crimes was the public walk of shame. Accused women were sometimes forced to parade barefoot through town, wearing only a shift or undergarment, holding candles or wearing signs declaring their sin. These humiliating processions were meant to strip away dignity while reinforcing community control. Clothing was powerful symbolism. A woman stripped of her belt, a sign of chastity, or forced to wear rags was publicly branded as impure. Sometimes garlands of straw or ropes were placed around the neck to signal disgrace. These were punishments not for the body alone, but for the soul, intended to purge through humiliation. And yet, these ceremonies also drew curious crowds. The same townspeople who claimed to uphold moral virtue came to watch the scandal unfold. Punishment became theater, sin became entertainment, and justice blurred with cruelty. By the late Middle Ages, another dark element entered these trials: the fear of witchcraft. Accusations of immoral behavior, especially against women, often blended with claims of sorcery or demonic influence. A woman who defied social norms could be branded not just sinful but unholy, in league with the devil himself. The witch hunts that followed in the early modern period were rooted in these earlier patterns. Female sexuality, independence, and disobedience were demonized. What had once been seen as moral failing became framed as cosmic evil. The woman who lived alone, the midwife who knew too much about childbirth, or the widow who managed her own affairs, all became targets of suspicion. While women faced public shaming, men's transgressions were often met with lighter penalties. A wandering knight with a mistress might earn admiration rather than punishment. The hypocrisy was built into the system. Laws on chastity and fidelity were written to protect male property rights, not to safeguard female autonomy. When women were punished, it was rarely for the act itself alone. It was for stepping outside their prescribed role. Whether the offense was real or imagined, punishment reminded society that a woman's honor was not her own. It belonged to her father, husband, or guardian. At its heart, medieval sexual morality trials were about fear. Fear of divine punishment, fear of social disorder, fear of women's independence. The spectacle of public shaming, whether in the stocks, under the scold's bridle, or in the humiliating walk of penance, taught entire communities a single lesson: obey or suffer. But these punishments also reveal something deeper about medieval society. They show how closely intertwined faith, law, and daily life were. They show how communities were bound together not only by shared belief but by shared terror of disgrace. The courts of morality in the Middle Ages did not simply exist to punish crime, they existed to control society. And at the heart of their control was the body, especially the female body. The law claimed to defend virtue, but it often served as an instrument of fear, reminding entire communities who held power, and at what cost. Women were not merely judged by what they had done, but by what they represented. A widow who dressed too brightly could be accused of tempting men. A young woman who met a man after sunset might be charged with loose behavior. Evidence mattered less than appearances, and appearances were everything. Consider the case of a young servant girl in 14th century England, dragged before a church court for wanton speech. The accusation: she had laughed too loudly in a tavern and shared a drink with a stranger. There was no crime in drinking, no law against laughter. Yet to those in power, her cheerfulness itself was suspicious, a sign of an unchaste spirit. She was forced to stand barefoot before the congregation, her hair unbound in shame, while a priest denounced her from the pulpit. Public rituals of penance like this were common. They were designed not to heal but to humiliate. Town squares became theaters of morality, where neighbors turned into spectators. People would gather to watch a woman in a white smock walk through the streets carrying a candle, or kneel at the church door holding a confession board around her neck. The lesson was simple. Disobey the social order, and you would be put on display as a warning to others. Punishments for sexual misconduct varied widely, but all carried a single message: control over desire, and especially over women. The infamous scold's bridle, an iron cage locked around the head with a spiked plate pressing on the tongue, silenced those accused of gossip or lewd talk. Some were paraded through town wearing it, a cruel parade meant to strip them of dignity. In Germany and the Low Countries, women suspected of adultery or prostitution could be forced to wear shame masks forged with grotesque features: pig snouts, donkey ears, or demonic grins. These masks were heavy, painful, and deliberately ridiculous. Laughter became a weapon against the condemned. The crowd was invited not only to watch, but to mock. Even men were not immune. Those caught visiting brothels or seducing married women might be whipped, fined, or forced to march naked through the streets holding their own clothing. Yet the cultural double standard was unmistakable. A man's sin could often be paid off in coin. A woman's sin clung to her forever, staining her reputation long after her punishment ended. These trials were not only about sex, they were about power. The church claimed authority over the soul, and by regulating desire, it kept communities in fear of both divine wrath and earthly shame. The line between crime and sin blurred. To defy the court was to defy God himself, at least in the eyes of those who enforced the rules. In France during the 13th century, records show that entire villages were summoned to witness the penance of a single woman accused of living in sin. She had to walk barefoot in winter, clad only in her shift, carrying a heavy cross as the crowd jeered. By the time she reached the parish church, her feet were bleeding. Yet no one dared help her. To show sympathy was to risk being suspected yourself. The punishment was not meant for her alone. It was meant to terrify everyone. Some punishments took stranger forms. In parts of Italy, women accused of promiscuity might be sentenced to ride backwards on a donkey through the streets, holding the donkey's tail in her hands. In Spain, records describe women made to sweep the cathedral steps as an act of public penance, wearing signs that announced their alleged sins. But perhaps the most chilling punishments were those that never made it into official law books, those enforced by local custom. Communities often took justice into their own hands, staging chivalries, or noisy midnight processions outside the homes of suspected adulterers. Villagers would bang pots, shout insults, and demand that the accused appear in their nightclothes. These public shaming rituals blurred the line between law and mob, church and street, sacred duty and personal vengeance. And yet, beneath the cruelty, there is a deeper story. These trials were not only about punishing immorality. They reflected a society anxious about change. The medieval world was shifting. Towns were growing, markets were booming, women were gaining new visibility as workers, traders, even property holders. The control of sexual behavior was a way to control this unsettling social freedom. By policing desire, authorities tried to police change itself. But fear is never stable. Over time, these harsh punishments bred resentment. As literacy spread and townsfolk learned to record their own grievances, we begin to see glimpses of resistance. Petitions survive from villagers who protested unfair judgments, defending neighbors accused of fornication or gossip. In some places, people mocked the very rituals meant to humble them, treating public penance as a joke rather than a disgrace. By the late Middle Ages, secular courts began to challenge the church's dominance over morality. Civil authorities cared less about sin and more about order, shifting focus to crimes that threatened property or peace. But the shadow of medieval moral courts did not vanish. It lingered in ideas about female honor, about controlling women's speech, clothing, and independence. The echoes of these trials reach into the present. We may no longer parade people through the streets in shame masks or iron bridles, but the instinct to control others through public humiliation is far from gone. In medieval times, the town square was the stage. Today, it might be the internet. The tools have changed, but the hunger to judge remains hauntingly familiar. When we look back at these dark chapters of justice, we see more than cruelty, we see a mirror. We see how fear of desire can turn neighbors into jailers, and how systems of power can disguise themselves as guardians of virtue. We also see how ordinary people, forced to watch these humiliations, sometimes found quiet ways to resist, whispering sympathy to the condemned, refusing to laugh when ordered to jeer. The story of sexual morality on trial in the Middle Ages is not just about the past. It is about how societies wrestle with change, how they cling to control, and how they use shame as a weapon. And it is a reminder that justice, when wielded without mercy, becomes something else entirely. A spectacle, a warning, a dark echo of power.